la vérité touche au réel.
Young Zizekians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Sbriglia.
Is it Omar?
Engaging the unconscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Apocalypse Sao, and I'm joined today by my other from another other. That's other with a capital O, as in O snap. We're back at it again with another deep dive into Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning.
Meaning is the big deal. You know, we're learning how to individuate. The real process of meaning comes from the fact that, you know, you go from being Pinocchio to a boy, you know, and that's the process. And if you don't, then you become psychotic.
And you end up in a self-induced coma.
Yeah.
Which, to give Peterson credit, doesn't always sound like a bad idea, a self-induced coma. One way of dealing with late-stage capitalism. Go to Russia, put yourself into a self-induced coma. What could go wrong?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So today we are talking the psychoses, and we have reached chapter 4. Well, Andrew, I would like to inform you that I've just been to the butcher's.
Style. Right. And so for the context of this essay or this lecture, which will conclude the first section, let's take a moment to reflect on everything that we talked about in the last few sessions, that we're dealing with precisely something with meaning. And one thing that I should kind of point out, a huge detail, which I don't think I emphasized enough in the last ones, when we talk about psychosis and this, you could say, non-relation to language, there's the way that they speak, but yet they're not hooked on the language. It's as if in their delusions, everything is full of meaning, full of excess. And this is because of the fact that for them, they have no signifying chain or signifying structure in the way that a neurotic operates through, and that's via repression. You know, repression, again, isn't something that is, again, stored deep down. These contents, these past experiences that are stored deep down in this like basement of your subconscious mind, or this sort of cauldron of instincts, right? It's not like the sort of depth psychology. Repression happens in the sort of gaps of the way that you signify your life or your speech. There are certain moments which that can't be accounted for, like sort of slippages. If you think of like a film, like a film, that it's not a continuous thread when it plays out. There's always those sort of cuts in between. And that is what we could see as the sort of repressive mechanism that kind of creates gaps that can't account for everything when you retroactively account for your life. Now, with that being said, because there is no repression, there's also no metaphorization, substitution. And examples of this are an interpretation of dreams when we talk about displacements or condensations, in which an object substitutes something for another object, or what we get is a certain condensed metaphor in which we have a bunch of associations for that. Like, you know, somebody could have a dream of, you know, I don't know, like a haunted house, and then they like see their a parent in there, and like there's just like a condensation of different things that could be associated, versus like maybe you're repressing some unfulfilled wish and it gets satisfied in a sort of displaced object, right? And because of the lack of repression, like we talked about Verwerfung, we have these episodes of hallucination that take on full in and of itself, and what we're trying to say is, like, for instance, when we talk about in the past lecture, this sort of neologism that's pointed out in Schraber, nerve contact, or in the other patient that is referenced by Lacan, who uses this other neologism, galopinaire, in which this whole thing doesn't create a sort of metaphorization to help cope with reality and a substitute of enjoyment, but rather remodels reality. And I use this term because as we get into the beginning of this lecture, Lacan talks about two essays, and one of them I'm referencing, specifically the loss of reality in neurosis and psychosis. Now, it's an essay by Freud. I don't know what year it's written, 1924. So Freud talks about the sort of loss of reality, and what that means is that, like, we don't see reality as itself. In fact, there's like a sort of traumatic element to reality for both the neurotic and the psychotic, but due to repression on the level of neurosis, we get a sort of way in which we take flight from reality, and we have a sort of substitute fantasy for it. You know, we have, and this is where we'll get in Lacan, the sort of object cause of desire. We could think of it, I think Zizek talks about this, our friend Michael Downs told us about this. It's like, for the neurotic, in a sense, it's like Pokemon Go. Like, you don't see reality as it is. In fact, when you're in the frame of the Pokemon Go phone, things pop up in a location like a Pokemon, things that are causing your desire, and yet they don't necessarily exist out in the reality principle, but it's the sort of enframing in which your subjectivity can maneuver. But for the psychotic, they, in a sense, remodel things with their imaginary hallucinatory fantasy that's full of meaning within in itself without a signifier. And so that's a sort of snippet of what we're going to get into in this seminar. The last thing I'll say, too, is that, and I want to quote this because Freud says this at the end, and I found it that was really interesting. He says right here, "It can hardly be doubted that the world of fantasy plays the same part in psychosis, and that there too is the storehouse from which materials or patterns for buildings the new realities are derived. But whereas the new imaginary external world of psychosis attempts to put itself in the place of external reality, that of neurosis, on the contrary, is apt, like the play of children, to attach itself to a piece of reality, a different piece from one against which it has to defend itself, and to lend a piece of special importance and secret meaning, which we, not always quite appropriately, call a symbolic one." So thus we see that both in neurosis and psychosis, there comes into consideration the question not only of a loss of reality, but the substitute reality. And so there we can see a parallel, but also a distinction. In this essay, and I'll finally shut up, Freud talks about a way in which, well, for the neurotic, yes, they find a substitute, and there's a sort of a loss of reality, but we have a level of adaptation, whereas for, and uses the term autoplastic, but for the psychotic, we have alloplastic, in which the psychotic, through its fantasy or hallucination, delusion, reconstructs the external world as the fantasy itself, as the hallucination. And he uses the term disavow, which I don't think he means it in the same way as the perverse fetishistic disavow, but in a way that reality is sort of denied and rejected.
Right. And here, near the end of the chapter, Lacan is going to cite Saussure,
right,
as having described nicely the difference between the diachronic and the synchronic dimensions of language. And what's interesting to me about that is Saussure made great strides towards helping realign philosophy's interests without even intending to. And this distinction between the diachronic and the synchronic is very important. I remember in course on general linguistics in the beginning, he says the interesting thing about linguistics, what makes linguistics, at least up until that point, so muddled, is that it is charged with the task of understanding language diachronically in terms of its history, let's say as like a kind of archaeology of sorts, and then synchronically as a body of, well, in this case, differential oppositional signifiers. Both grounds are covered by linguistics, but they seem to function differently.
Right.
They only overlap insofar as we have an individual subject who uses language in an idiosyncratic way, as we all do. However, language can't be, and I think it's called an idiolect, a private language for a person who has any hope of operating in quote unquote reality.
Right.
Now, he also uses this metaphor, Lacan does, not Saussure, of the stave, which I had to look up, but that's like the parallel lines in musical notation. And he talks about how for Schreber, language in its diachronic dimension is kind of like a stave. And what I pictured was moving between these parallel lines.
Right.
Not now, you can tell me if I'm wrong here. This is just me spitballing, but that for him, language is not this synchronic network of differential signifiers, which, as you were explaining before, would imply a kind of metonymic switching from one to another, substitution, but rather the way he has his privileged signifiers, soul murder, nerve contact, and then signifiers that he says are imported into his little realm from others,
right,
fabricated others, puppet others, which we'll get into, that there's an essential difference here in that he's able to sort of distinguish between two kinds of words, but the words that are in some sense precariously holding his semblance of a symbolic together are more like this stave, and that he's
right,
from element to element. It's the elements within the words, the not just the meanings of words, but also even just like the phonic elements of the words that in some sense keep this sliding from
from happening
too crazy, too haywire.
And so like it seems like and Lacan also talks about he'll be like, don't tell me, like he's like, or it's Saussure that says this, so I'll leave it to him. But he says like one cannot but give discourse a certain direction in time, a direction that is defined in a linear manner, right? And so like that seems to me to be the sort of diachronic aspect, but it's the sort of dialectic between synchrony and diachronic that not only does a word become discourse, but it also allows for the differential network to define it and to be able to stand the test of time, but also retroactively come back in its sort of temporal history and its metonymic and differential meaning. But it seems like for something like Gallipanere and something like nerve contact, soul murder, solar anus, and all that stuff, that these things don't stand a sort of test of time and have this progression in which they have a transformation and map out a differential network. They're sort of like isolated and model this external reality for its own sake.
So I don't know if what I was saying about the diachronic plays into that, but I just thought it was interesting that he brings up that distinction in relation to the way that Schreber uses language, but maybe I'm missing something too. It seems
because the diachronic is the sort of linear chronological history, right, of a word or signifier.
But it's like the vertical, the vertical line versus horizontal too.
Okay,
that's the other thing. But yeah, I think it is linear.
Yeah. and maybe I'm confusing it because I'm more playing on the lines of how like Lacan would appropriate, especially how the signifier operates in his graph of desire once you have the sort of chronological movement and then the retroactive that comes up and around to create the shape of the graph.
Yeah, maybe I got that wrong though, because he says it's not quite exact to say it's a simple line. It is more probably a set of several lines, a stave. It is this diachronism that discourse is set up.
Right. And because that has to do with the sort of movement and its progression, because that stave is like what you were saying, that's the sort of has to do with music, right? And what we put notes on.
The signifiers existing synchronically is sufficiently characterized in delusional talk by modification. I've already pointed out here, namely that certain elements become isolated, laden, take on a value, a particular force of inertia, become charged with a meaning and nothing more. Schreber's book is overflowing with them.
Right.
So I think I misapplied this stave thing, but it kind of works. I feel like maybe
but it's funny because it's like meaning and nothing more. Well, you think that like for like a sort of someone who isn't into like structural linguistics or doesn't understand this modality, it's like as if like, oh, so it like it means something, but it's like, yes, but only insofar as that it's for Schreber's reality. But like it's not anything to do with discourse or like, yeah, like that's the only thing I'd say, like a sort of like discourse of like a science or philosophy. Although doesn't he kind of make a reference that like what Schreber's doing is no different than like the philosophers I mentioned with like his terms.
Right. Yeah. The philosopher is equally paranoid and delusional insofar as they make one concept or one theme the fulcrum of their entire system.
Right. But what keeps them from being as such like a Schreber is the fact that they have the element of doubt. Like for instance, like someone like Descartes. Right. Yeah. Whereas like Schreber and a psychotic has certainty in their delusions, which I think right here would be probably if you're up to it, transition to what we meant in the beginning by I have been to the butchers.
Right. So we can get into that. We have Lacan's two patients who are, as he says, sort of completely isolated for most of their lives in this one-to-one feminine friendship.
Yeah.
And then one of them marries and it disturbs the entire configuration that they had set up. It's crucially destabilizing for them, or for the one patient that he's talking to. And he wants to describe how he was able to identify something. She recounts an encounter that she describes how he was able to identify it as delusional.
Right.
Actually, this man who married his patient's friend was a violent sort of person, right, who threatened her because he felt like she was an intrusive.
Right. And something about like, which before we add up might have said something about like that he'll like slice her up or something like that. But yeah, she felt threatened. But yeah, continue.
Well, he had threatened to cut her up, so that's an important detail to take note of. And then she recounts again to Lacan that I guess before their session, and I think it was their initial session possibly, that he had run into her
right
on the way there
and he's also someone of loose morals according to the account. So like he's like supposed to be like very adulterous, right?
Right. I don't know if it's just her portrayal of him, but he's supposed to be this sort of reprobate, and it's important that we emphasize that she says,
Yes.
I've just been to the butcher's. Now, butcher here in French, in one of the footnotes, it says is charcuterie, which is a butcher of pigs, pork
Right.
butcher specifically. So Lacan says pig,
Yeah.
right? That's the first signifier
Yeah.
that crops up, and she says that the man's response to her saying, I've just been to the butcher's, was sow,
Right.
which is another word for pig. So
Right.
this is very charged with meaning, but I don't know if we want to
Well,
underline this aspect of it first, but it's very strange that I guess the way she recounted it is sort of out of sequence.
yeah, and it's also interesting because like apparently this saying is like a very like innuendo. It's like a sexual innuendo because it's like it's supposed to be it's a saying that it's like a handler of not pig but pork products, but it's like a sexual advancement, like I know how to handle sausage type thing, and saying that like, you know, you want to like be down to have sex or something like that. I think our buddy Brian Becker points this out in his episode on this. But needless to say, like it is interesting how she kind of recounts it in a different sequence. But ultimately, with this, it's like she's definitely certain that he said this, that his response was sow.
Right. And this is delusional thought in that we have two small others whose interaction here leaves no room for the other with a capital O, the big other, which I think of as like the other beyond the one-to-one ego involvement that characterizes the imaginary, the other that ratifies meaning.
Well, and so let's go back to the fundamental constituents of what psychosis versus that was a Freudian slip, but I was about to talk about castration, but neurosis.
You're going to say capitalism.
Castration. Because like you're pointing out, there's this 1-to-1 ratio. Now, mind you, this person apparently suffers from erotomania or erotomaniac symptoms. So this sort of delusion that this other person is secretly in love with them, and there are tons of literature on this. It is actually coined by one of Lacan's colleagues, and he mentions him a handful of times. Monsieur Clarenbolt, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he was a psychiatrist and also somewhat of like a Freudian revisionist, but he coins the diagnosis and sees it as something merely in women. But I think no, men can definitely suffer from erotomania as well. But the point being is that it's like as if this intrusive other is in love with this person, and thus the delusion of the sort of sexual advancements in the form of this, but yet rather than sex, it's more of chopping up. And so why this is interesting is because, well, what separates the psychotic from the neurotic is the admission into the symbolic, which represents the second form of separation, alienation, and that's symbolic castration as well. And there's this relationship between psychosis and the feminine or a feminine position, insofar as we're talking about the relationship between the child and the mother, the imaginary other, the sort of maternal phallus. And it's almost like an imaginary 1-to-1 ratio until the third part comes in to separate and enter into language. So it is as if there is this masculine, male, intrusive other that simulates as a threat and an intrusion.
Right. This is something Darian Leader emphasizes in What is Madness, that many psychotics go through life without evincing any symptoms of psychosis until they find themselves in a triangular situation with, let's call it O, little o apostrophe, and then a third element. And that disturbs that 1-to-1 ratio, because he doesn't say it here, but I'm sure he will say it in a few chapters. The name of the father is never really taken hold. And it's like, without the name of the father taking hold, then there can't be this big other, which serves as the backdrop for all meaning. And it's that the backdrop also, I would say, just to bring it back to linguistics, kind of like the backdrop for the synchronic dimension of language.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say it's like what or who, we could almost say, to whom we refer when we speak? I mean, there's transactional speech. And then, as he outlined in the previous chapter, there's feint and fides. Feint, deceptive speech. Fides, I think of as a vow, an oath, a pact. This is the kind of speech that ultimately relies on a big other for the certainty of the speech, not just being airy, empty, kind of small talk, but something of a different order, in the sense that it will change things, right? It will change the state of one's life. In the case of fides, it could, the consequences of taking a vow, yes, they depend on the little other in front of you, the ego, that is your, mirror saying yes, of course. But that, like, if you say, will you marry me? That would be an example I would think of as like the kind of speech that corresponds to fides. But that little other, the person you want to be your spouse, is in the place of the big other in that moment. So there's a third element there, which is the subject. And he also equates it with the subject as such, capital S subject. You address yourself to that which gives you recognition, and it must be recognized to begin with. It's not enough. The problem with like another small o ego recognizing you is that it's not really recognition, because I would think, if you think about it in terms of like the mirror stage, what's imaginary is that you can risk absorbing that other, being absorbed into the other, having the other absorb you. It's like, there's no clear demarcation.
And there's no like sort of virtual point in which it's not just two small O's. It's like not just that I see this person and this person sees me. It's that I see them seeing me. That sort of ability to have not only just two bodies, but the minimal difference between the two persons, which makes it a third. And when you also talk about like your examples, like will you marry me, or like I do, like these, yes, they're symbolic statements and stuff like that, and they have a sort of big other to them, and yet it's an absence. It's like almost like a vanishing mediator. And it always goes back to like seminar 1 when he talks about J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, that there's a sort of absent performativity that comes about with certain speech statements. Again, like a psychotic wouldn't put two and two together. But like when you're at the dinner table, oh, there's the salt. Like you were looking for the salt, but it also performs an absence of saying, can you hand me the salt? Which is something that you don't see it or doesn't come to mind if you don't have this minimal difference, which is encapsulated by the differential network of speech. Not only do we have our language, it's not enough to just have one signifier, but the binary signifier, the S2, is a sort of math theme that shows that a signifier is always caught up in a differential network. But what makes it differential is that minimal difference in between a signifier and another signifier.
Right. And
so there we just get a chain of signifiers, because the signifier already implies a network of signification.
And to the degree that that chain of signifiers is caught up in not just conversations that we have with one another, how we use language to bring meaning to things, but also how we act, that language carries with it the potential deployment of an entire series of protocols,
right,
that are extremely complicated, and which, at least for most neurotics, are engaged with almost as second nature, in a way that's really mind-boggling if you think about it. And that's what it means to think of this big other embracing an entire synchronic network. It's that we're not just talking about dialogue. We're talking about how people act in accordance with the signifying chain.
And like an example Lacan gives right here in section 3, page 53, if you're using the Russell Grigg translation. He says right here, with the signifying material, that we have the statement death to the bastards. This must be deducible from long live the king. I guess there's a certain relation to those two statements, which could only happen in a network of signification. But this is something.
Well, in that case, he's talking about, though, Esperanto. He's making a joke because he's saying like these artificial languages that are supposed to be hooked to like reference, I guess.
Yeah.
Don't work.
Oh, okay.
Because he's saying that like that's a joke he's making, because in the footnote it says bastards is death to cows in French,
right,
and it's like an idiom, and he's saying that like, well, everything would be deducible from everything else on the basis of its like of every signifier corresponding to some sort of like definite object in the world. So yeah, I think that's like a joke that plays on certain like a French puns or whatever.
Right, but and I think even then, looking at that, it's something that I don't even think a psychotic would be able to do, or at least not be aware that they're doing it or see it like that. With especially, I mean, the whole thing about puns and jokes is important to Freud, because he made a whole book on it, on the unconscious, and how like that sort of manifests the sort of formations of symptoms in neurosis.
Right.
But I get what you're saying though. Like, yeah, like I read that wrong, but I think
it's
to shift the perspective, it would still show how language functions even on the level of puns and jokes, which then you get multiple meanings.
Well, because but I guess I don't know enough about Esperanto, but he says here that like, yes, you theoretically you could deduce cow, heifer, vealer from the word ox. And I guess maybe it's not so much that these words in Esperanto are all associated with a very definite, like, easily isolable meaning, but that like they're sort of nested in each other phonetically. I think, I don't know if anyone knows about Esperanto, maybe they can explain it, but I guess like you can find cow in its relation with ox, in its relation with heifer, and obviously some words in our language work this way because there are elements that they have in common in terms of like phonemes and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
I think Esperanto is supposed to be like hyperlogical in that sense.
Okay. But like, wouldn't that go to like the whole thing about like, so Sir and like his like, map of like the signifier and the signified, and we like, the tree and leaves type thing. Is that the same sort of logic of being able to deduce different things from the signifier?
I really don't know. I think he says they're forms of deduction, but I don't know if he means just like purely semantic in terms of how these words are written, the elements that make them up,
Right. Like
or if he
in the
means
same
like, yeah,
like an analytic state judgment, kind of like what Kant would say, like bachelor, like an unmarried man, like the definitions contained within the word.
yeah. But the impression that I got was that we're talking about like actual what do they say in language? There's like paradigm, and then I don't know how to say it, syntagm, or it's like syntagm. Like,
Yeah, syntag. Yeah, I know. Yeah,
like they're the elements that are like, I guess the written, like the structural elements versus what you produce by speech. I don't know. Now I'm like getting beyond my scope here, but
the Saussurian stuff is pretty ethereal.
I mean, my productive misreading today was of Stave. So let's see.
Well, we all got our. I got my productive misreading of Esperanto. So we're one for one right there.
It makes me want to read more about Esperanto, but I think it's interesting that the innuendo undertone here, the sexual dimension that I guess is brought into the picture with this utterance has an interesting resonance also with what he says here about the fragmentation.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing too.
Because there's this, and he says this in one of the chapters of Seminar 2 about this partialization of the body and the ego that occurs in analysis. And I think we could miss the fact that not only is the big other, at least at this point in time, I don't know if this will change, but not only is the big other in some way the guarantor of a meaning which is not purely, I mean, the effective meaning is imaginary, but a symbolic meaning which supposedly supersedes the 1-to-1 ratio, but also it is the let's say like kind of clothespin holding together the various elements of the body, and it's like the fragmentary pieces of the body. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and
that's the imaginary dimension of it.
Yeah, and if you go back to the mirror stage essay, and even when he in seminar 1, when he's playing on the essay with the optical schema, the ideal ego, which is the representation of the body as first identification, is always a misrecognition on the point that it's not a total body, but a fragmented body taken as an image. And so it seems like that part kind of gets more alien when we get into language, because we have this big other as you're talking about. But what it also makes me think of too as fragmentation, with the loss of reality in that essay. There is he talks about the sort of piece of reality or partial part of reality, and it makes me think that Lacan's rendition of this for the neurotic and the way that it adapts to reality is the object cause of desire as that fragmented piece that's lost and is also what is driving the neurotic's desire versus the psychotic. This fragmentation sort of remodels reality in the form of their delusions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, and he's going to talk about how something like elementary phenomena constructed around a delusion, how that works,
Yeah.
how
And
that plays out. He's going
Right.
to later, but right now he's just talking about kind of how to spot delusional talk. And it's interesting though, because it's like these sorts of examples work on different levels. I mean, we have a whole matrix of different possible interpretations here. I mean, on the one
Right.
hand, you have the temporal sequencing of the two utterances. He says that, usually the response follows the allocution, whereas in this
Right.
case, we have the response that precedes the allocution. In this case, the allocution is a kind of insult. But also there is then even though we famously, the psychotic is unable to create metaphors, Sal, and I've just been to the butcher's, seems to still like metaphorize something in a sexual,
And it's like,
but it isn't
yeah.
deployed as a metaphor.
No.
That the metaphorical dimension isn't available to
Right.
the one who speaks the words, because they've already not depersonalized, but they've already, and he says, like, let's not think of this as psychological projection, which is part of common parlance now, but like they've already, in some sense, embodied the, what would you say, like the lack of a big other in the small other who speaks to them.
And so I think right here, this is where we could bring up the three registers, because right here we have this instance in where, because it's always in this 1-to-1 ratio with her, especially because of her friend. So you have this 1-to-1 ratio of her and a feminine little other, and then the intrusion of this separate other experience on an imaginary level, but is also very evasive, very obviously someone of loose morals, but whatever her delusions and her erotomania is, that it's seen as like a sort of person that's going to cut her up and fragment her. She's not hooked onto the symbolic order, so it's as if there's someone else that's speaking in the real, this subject that isn't barred. It isn't this subject that's an obsession on which like that from the real speaks, that sort of traumatic point of the origin of the subject through the other, but rather the sort of the subject, a speaking subject that somehow speaks, but as he says, it's like they're in third person, or it's just like this sort of alien other, or this alien speaker that's separate from the speaking ego. Does that make sense?
Right. Like when we say 1-to-1 ratio, there could be, for Schreber, for this patient, they're is an entire host of others, of little others that they're able to acknowledge, but they're all sort of extensions of their own ego. And what I was thinking of when you talked about this intrusive third is we call someone in that case a sort of a third party.
Yeah.
And then there's also this expression to be party.
Yeah.
Something is like to be a witness.
Yeah.
And who is the ultimate witness of all of our actions but the big other?
Yeah.
So without the intervention of the big other, then the only possible witness is another little other.
Yeah.
And in this case, I think that has something to do with like, okay, we see ourselves being seen by the big other, which means that we, even when we're alone, you know, we act in ways that we hope will in some ways satisfy the requirements of the big other. And this is what Slavoj calls the order of appearances. That's one dimension of the big other. That's like, we need this sort of witness.
Yeah.
But because there's no big other here, I think the witness in this case is this sort of diabolical character who has driven almost a wedge between this woman and her friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
But because she hears what he says, what she says, in a sense, in the real, in the form of this other, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but maybe it is a way of, you know, approximating something like a big other, and to be seen. Like there is this dialectic of recognition, right?
Yeah.
Which is the master slave dialectic when we're dealing with the big other. In this case, for the psychotic, there can't be a master slave relation.
No, definitely not, because to be seen like that is sort of persecutory, or in the sense like the paranoia comes from something like that, or even an intrusion, like to be like if somebody's trying to break through their barrier, like to break inside them. Yeah, this is like the whole thing of like when you look at like the stereotypical like paranoiac of like aliens are watching me or hacking my brain or like the government spying on me type thing. It's like literally like they're being watched over, invaded. There's intrusion, all these sorts of scenarios that make it feel like somebody from without is coming within, and I'm being recognized.
And there is, of course, the theme of certainty here. I'm certain that Sao was addressed to me, whereas with the neurotic, whose entire being, in a sense, hinges on this distinction, which is not really a distinction because these two antipodes, let's say, are almost one and the same between fides and feint, language that deceives, and then the vow. Because, you know, because the neurotic stakes their own being, their own symbolic definition on the unknown and uncertainty in the other, the big other. They're able to sort of, let's say, for lack of a better articulation of this, sort of throw things out there. It's like, let's throw things out there, see what happens.
Yeah.
Just like when you take a knee and propose, it's possible that the person you're proposing to, and it does happen, will refuse you in that moment, you know, and like when you see on the Jumbotron, that's happened like a few times. This is like this absolutely devastating refusal. It only has importance in that case, right, because the outcome is at least theoretically uncertain.
Yeah.
But nothing's really uncertain for
No.
the paranoid delusional psychotic.
Yeah. When you talked about that dropping the knee or something in like the uncertainty of it, it kind of for some reason this popped in my head. But like when you go to like baseball games and like they had that big screen like during
That's what I said, the
like
jumbotron.
the jumbotron. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it's called with the kid, like the kissing. Yeah, I didn't know that's what it was called, but yeah, that's yeah. But yeah, that's the same. It's the same kind of logic right there. Yeah. Yeah, I get what you're saying. But and ultimately for these delusions, it is their reality. Which is it's something that, like the neurotic, is something that is both a flight from reality, but also encapsulates the reality. But the difference is that they don't have like repression and language to create these metaphoric, metonymic structures to kind of piece together the reality, even if there is gaps. Whereas like for this, the certainty provides wholeness for them, because when we talk about the sort of mythic origin of the subject and in neurosis, it's always this point in which the no of the father comes, and then loss happens, and they're admitted to this network of substitution, and therefore we get desire. And desire is a way we deal with lack, and it's always this struggle between lack and loss, drive and desire. But we don't have this in this moment. We have just pure certainty. We don't have desire. We have delusions and paranoia.
And we could take it back to the beginning of this chapter with the dyad here of Beahung and Verneinung, and that for the neurotic, there must be a primordial symbolization, which I suppose is sort of a concomitant of primordial repression. I don't know if that's true.
I would say maybe not primordial repression, but ultimately the primordial cause of the subject. Okay,
right.
Yeah.
I'm mixing my Zupancic with what we're reading here. But like, yeah, there's this primordial cause of the subject, which is a primordial symbolization, which is kind of a mythic moment, right? He doesn't say there's actually a stage that doesn't like happen all at once. So there's one specific actual symbol that acts as like the entry point necessarily into the symbolic order. But I would think that it's something that's revived almost, but like ex nihilo within analysis. But I think the idea is that the shape, let's say, of one's repression, what one flies from, what one takes flight from, is still very much determinative of the very symbolic structure of one's world, meaning what's missing crucially determines what one's mapped world appears to them as. And that and through analysis, I guess you would, I don't know if you return to a primordial affirmation or not, but like Verneinung, right, as this moment of denying something that suddenly pops up, maybe denying the return of the repressed in real time, a way of tamping it back down is a way of trying to like reaffirm someone's symbolic universe in that moment, because it would seem to me to return to that primordial affirmation there would also be to lose your
Right.
symbolic world.
Lose.
Tell me where I'm wrong here. I know
It would be like pretty much to lose what you don't have, because like what it would signify though in that primordial affirmation, and which is why it has to be negated, is because it retroactively evokes something traumatic, because that's the whole point about primordial symbolization in this mythic moment, which is charged with a lot of signification the more you go down, but it represents a traumatic imprinting. This is why in that lecture on Verneinung in seminar 1, he ties it primordial affirmation in Biaohung with also the term the Praugung, where there is this mark of the time of the subject, which is also in that moment usually traumatic, not because of something really traumatic that happened, but just it's sort of the symbolic shape in which any future trauma could happen. And so it's like anything that comes traumatic, it's only because the symbolic curvature of that space and the marking of that traumatic or of that imprinting allows it to be such. It's like the shape of one's own symbolic, and subjectivity, allows it to fit something in, but also there's stuff within the form, the content that just can't be recognized as such, and that's why like there's always that excess that escapes symbolization. That's the sort of real subject that happens, because there is also a real subject that happens in that moment of the cause of the subject that can't be accounted for as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Because it's like with Verneinung, that cut that emerges in that moment, we know that we've hit upon a nerve. Take a page from Schreber's book there.
Struck a nerve.
We've struck a nerve there in that, but the nerve is a kind of fissure that separates the subject. The subject that identifies itself with the ego from the subject of the unconscious, if I'm getting that right. And that something about the specific shape of that fault line has something to do with this primordial imprinting, this primordial affirmation. It's not just like the erasure of the subject, like a kind of cancellation, but it's also like what emerges is if there's a hole there, it's like the exact shape of the hole.
No,
and
yeah, exactly.
It does have a specific kind of shape.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense.
And no, but like, and then like, obviously like we're not in this sort of jargon yet of Lacan, but and it's the perfect hole that this object cause of desire is supposed to fit, but can never, get, right?
For the neurotic.
Yeah.
And then for the psychotic, you shared that message from your friend Mark Murphy there about like how for the psychotic, though, it's, well, you can tell us what the difference is there, right? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think
foreclosure.
Yeah, and then with foreclosure, right? It's just like it sort of rejects almost that attempt to create a whole or whatever. But yeah, like it's just like if negativity is a process, then Verifung is like the total rejection of any form of negativity.
But the whole is still in
because
reality,
the whole,
because you can't reject negativity ultimately. So
and it's kind of funny because even that video essay I made about negativity and psychoanalysis, when I talked about Verneinung, repression, Verifung, it's like to reject negativity is to negate negativity, but not in the process of which negativity for the neurotic structure is, but rather it's just like the repudiation of any form of dialectic. And then this is why I we could see D and G as, in a sense, they do like the psychotic discourse because they don't want lack. They don't, but it's like desiring production. Psychotics don't desire. Desire is lack. and so that's where, holding the Lacanian big stick, speak softly but carry a big stick. Our old friend Teddy Roosevelt, to say that desire is lack, that and it's a negative process, but it also has a sort of sense of freedom in it that the psychotic really doesn't, because the psychotic is only trapped in their own imaginary fragmented reality of pure delusions. So in a sense, there is still like maybe a hole that is in the imaginary, why they need that 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, because isn't it like for our Sao lady here, her entire sense of imaginary coalescence ultimately depends on this 1-to-1 ratio that's disturbed, right? So when you say like provisionally this little other for her succeeded in kind of maintaining something like a imaginary wholeness for her, or is that going too far? Like, I don't know, because the intervention or intrusion of this third party seems to like make her feel fragmented.
Yeah, and I think the recounting of it to Lacan makes her feel 1-to-1, because when he talks about saying, always be aware of the person that says you understand, and he says how he made a mistake in saying that. So I think it always maintains this 1-to-1 ratio. Now, at the same time, it doesn't mean when you're in analysis, you need to be this intrusive third other, because I don't know if you can fully make someone a neurotic. I don't think it's possible to make someone from psychotic to neurotic, but you could help them simulate certain neologisms that kind of help them cope in a world with
right
order. So it's like, what I'm trying to get at is like, in a sense, if Lacan did something any different, it would probably trigger this antagonism of like this third party.
Right. So that's a good point. Maybe it's also the presence of Lacan, which in some sense generated this hallucinatory moment.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
well,
but
no, the fact
obviously
is
he's involved in some sense.
Well, obviously he didn't do that, but he said you understand, which made him in this 1-to-1 ratio, but at the same time it maintains that sort of moment in which, like, damn, like now he has got to work. Maybe from my understanding, it's like now he has to work hard at understanding like what the structure of this person is and how their psychotic circuitry, their clinical structure operates in foreclosure.
But like, okay, so like, I guess what I was getting at earlier, again, to cite leader is, and I've heard Mikey say this too, Michael Downs of The Dangerous Maybe, that the many psychotics at least are very good at imitating others and are able to get by, and often for quite a long time, solely by imitating others. And I'm thinking that maybe again the intrusion of this person led to a kind of,
I would say that there's also something dangerous about a baby for a psychotic, because there's no certainty there. It's
no one to imitate.
Yeah, because you're quoting Mikey, and I was like, that's why Mikey is not a psychotic, because he says maybe, he's not certain.
I thought, okay.
Yeah. Psychotic, maybe is very dangerous for them,
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Talking about this now, I feel like there's a lot of facets that
and definitely
maybe it'll be cleared up a little bit more as we continue on, but
absolutely. And it just seems like now we're just going to get into more of the good stuff that we've always hoped for, which is the Saussurian linguistics and all that semiotic stuff that Lacan is infamous for. So like that's what also makes this seminar like it's still early Lacan, but it's like the sort of admission into his symbolic, the symbolic of desire and the subject and the name of the father and all that stuff.
Right. It's like psychosis is for him the a prism through
Right.
which the real symbolic and the imaginary can be reflected, and sort of each element fanned apart.
And you have to understand that he used to be a psychiatrist, and a lot of patients that he worked with were psychotic. So like this is what also makes him radically different from other psychoanalysts, and the fact that he's doing it from the perspective of the Freudian the Freudian discourse, because obviously Freud has some papers on psychosis, but he didn't think that psychotics were analyzable, and that his clinic was for the neurotic, it was for the hysteric. But Lacan, being the sort of radical thinker that he is not only making a different model of understanding psychosis as a clinical structure, but also maintaining the Freudian doctrine.
Right, which he's said from the start, his whole Baromean knot, his 3 registers, they are implicit, they are latent within Freud's system. Let's say they're the unconscious within Freud's system. And it's funny because he doesn't talk about these 3 registers as his own, really. If you think about it, it's like, no, like Freud talks about the symbolic order here. It's like, where does Freud talk about the symbolic order?
Show me.
Where's the receipts? Where's the receipts?
Yeah, it's like that Biden and Trump debate where he's like, tell us, quit telling us already. Show us. Where are they? Just show us.
Well, I think that's about an hour. I think that about covers it. As usual, a lot of dangling threads, a lot of phalluses yet to be tied together. What an image there.
Yep.
Our session on. So let's take a trip. The butcher.
And with that, I leave you with this. Sao.